On a Thursday morning in March of 1987, a man named Harlan Tesdall walked into the First National Bank of Osage County and signed his name to a piece of paper that ended 61 years of his family's farming. He didn't cry. He didn't argue. He set the pen down on the loan officer's desk, picked up his seed cap off the counter where he'd placed it when he walked in, and drove home on County Road 14 without stopping. His wife, Eunice, was standing on the porch when he pulled in. She didn't ask how it went. She already knew. The bank listed the property at $312,000. The house, the outbuildings, the equipment, and the barn. The barn alone they listed at $5,000, which tells you something about what the bank thought the barn was worth and something about what they thought was inside it. Let me tell you about Harlan Tesdall, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what happened when a buyer pried open the crate under the hayloft. Harlan was 68 years old in 1987, and he had farmed the same 480 acres in Osage County, Oklahoma, since he was 22. His father, Clement Tesdall, had broken that ground in 1926, the year after he came up from Texas with $400, a team of horses, and a wife who was 3 months pregnant with Harlan's older brother, Dale. Clement had farmed it through the Depression, through the Dust Bowl years when the topsoil blew east in curtains and the cattle died standing up in the fields. He had farmed it through the war years when you couldn't get parts for anything and you fixed what broke with baling wire and prayer. He had passed it to Harlan in 1958, when Harlan was 39 and Clement was 74, and finally willing to admit that his knees weren't going to cooperate anymore. Harlan had farmed it for another 29 years after that. Wheat, mostly, some cattle, a few hogs in the early years when hog prices made sense, which they stopped doing sometime around 1972 and never really started again. The farm crisis of the 1980s did to Harlan Tesdall what it did to tens of thousands of families across the Midwest. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way a field floods, slowly, then completely. Interest rates climbed. Land values fell. The operating loan he'd taken in 1981 to buy a new combine made sense when interest was one thing and made no sense at all when interest became another thing entirely. By 1985, he was behind. By 1986, he was behind in a way that required conversations with the bank that left him driving home on County Road 14 without stopping. By March of 1987, he was done. The bank gave him 90 days to vacate. He and Eunice moved into a rental house in Pawhuska, 14 miles away, and Harlan spent those 90 days doing what he'd spent his whole life doing, which was taking care of what needed to be taken care of. He drained the fuel from the equipment. He oiled the hinges on the barn doors. He stacked the good lumber in the equipment shed where it would stay dry. He did not go through the barn. Let me tell you about the barn, because the barn is the reason this story exists. Clement Tesdall had built that barn in 1931 out of rough-cut oak from a sawmill in Bartlesville that went out of business the following year. It was a big barn by the standards of the era, 60 feet wide, 90 feet deep, with a gambrel roof and a hayloft that ran the full length of the structure. By 1987, it was 56 years old and still sound. The oak framing had gone dark with age and the tin roof had been patched in 3 places, but the foundation was poured concrete and the posts were set deep and the whole thing stood as straight as the day Clement had raised it. The bank listed it at $5,000 because it was old, and because old barns cost money to maintain, and because the bank's appraiser had walked through it in about 4 minutes and decided it was a liability rather than an asset. He had noted the hayloft. He had noted the equipment stored on the ground floor. He had not gone all the way to the back. The crate under the hayloft was not easy to see. It sat in the far northeast corner of the barn, behind a stack of fence posts and a disassembled grain auger and a collection of other things that accumulate in a barn over 6 decades of continuous farming. It was built from the same rough-cut oak as the barn itself, which meant it was built in 1931 or thereabouts, and it was approximately 14 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 4 feet tall. It had been there so long that the barn cats had used it as a scratching post on one end, and the wood had gone gray and soft on the surface, though the interior boards were still tight. Clement had built it. Harlan had never opened it. He knew what was inside, or thought he did, and he had decided sometime in the late 1960s that it was not his to open. He had told Eunice about it once, in the way that you tell someone about a thing you've decided not to think about too much. She had nodded and not asked further questions, which was one of the reasons Harlan had married her. When the bank's property manager came to inventory the barn contents in May of 1987, he walked past the crate without noting it. When the first prospective buyer toured the property in June, a cattle operation out of Ponca City that was looking to expand, they walked through the barn and didn't ask about it. When the property finally sold in August of 1987, it sold to a man named Keith Beaumont, who was not a farmer. Let me tell you about Keith Beaumont, because you need to understand what kind of man he was before you can understand what he did next. Keith Beaumont was 44 years old in 1987, and he ran a farm equipment dealership in Tulsa that had made him comfortable and, in recent years, considerably more than comfortable. He sold modern equipment, Deere, Case YH, New Holland, and he was good at it, which is to say he understood what farmers needed and he understood what they could be persuaded to want. And he understood the difference between those two things and how to work with both. He had grown up on a farm in Mayes County, which meant he could talk to farmers in a way that dealers who hadn't grown up farming could not, and this was worth more to him than any sales training he'd ever received. He bought the Tesdall property not to farm it, but to hold it. Land in Osage County was cheap in 1987, in the way that land gets cheap when everyone who owns it is being forced to sell at the same time, and Keith Beaumont had enough capital and enough patience to understand that this was a circumstance rather than a permanent condition. He paid $287,000 for the whole property, which was $25,000 less than the bank's asking price, and he planned to lease the cropland and eventually sell when values recovered. He walked through the barn on the day of closing, which was a Tuesday in August, and he went all the way to the back. He saw the crate. He stood in front of it for a moment, looking at the size of it, looking at the way it had been built, the dovetailed corners, the heavy oak boards, the way whoever built it had taken real care with the joinery, even though it was just a storage box in a barn, and something about it made him stop. He was a man who had spent his adult life around equipment, and the size and shape of the crate told him something. The way the dimensions of a thing can tell you what it was built to hold before you ever open it. He found a pry bar in the equipment shed and came back. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever stood in front of something old and felt the weight of it before you knew what it was? Not the physical weight, but the other kind. The sense that whatever is in front of you has been waiting, that it has outlasted things, that it was built by someone who intended it to last and who was right about that intention. Keith Beaumont felt that standing in front of that crate in August of 1987, he was a practical man, a dealership man, a man who thought about equipment in terms of trade-in value and parts availability and resale. But he stood there for a long moment before he put the pry bar under the first board. The lid came off in 3 sections. The boards were tight, but the nails had rusted enough to give way without splitting the wood, and Keith Beaumont set each section aside carefully, which is itself a thing worth noting. A man who pries open a crate carelessly is a different kind of man than one who sets the boards aside. Underneath the lid was a layer of burlap, and underneath the burlap was a layer of waxed canvas, and underneath the waxed canvas was oil. Not pooled oil, but the smell of it, the presence of it. The whole interior of the crate had been coated in a heavy preserving oil before the lid was nailed down, and the oil had done its job. Whatever was inside had been put away the way you put away something you intend to come back to. He pulled the canvas back. What he found was an engine. Specifically, it was a stationary hit-and-miss engine, a 1.5 horsepower IHC Famous, manufactured by the International Harvester Company in 1909. It was painted red, or had been. The paint had oxidized to a deep brick color in places and gone entirely in others, but the castings were intact, the flywheel was present and uncracked, the fuel tank was sealed and had not rusted through, and the igniter assembly was complete. Beside it, wrapped separately in oilcloth, was a complete set of operating manuals, a parts diagram folded into a leather sleeve, and a handwritten note on a piece of paper that had gone yellow but remained legible. The note was in Clement Tesdall's handwriting, which Keith Beaumont didn't know, but which Harlan Tesdall would have recognized immediately. It said, "This engine was bought new by my father, Arvid Tesdall, in the spring of 1909 for the sum of $47.50, and used to power the well pump and the feed grinder on his farm in Comanche County until 1928, when the farm was sold. I have kept it because it is the only thing of his I have. Do not sell it. CT 1931." Keith Beaumont sat down on the crate. He sat there for a while in the dim light of the barn, with the smell of old oil and hay dust, and the sound of something moving in the rafters overhead, and he read the note again. Then he read it a third time. He was a practical man, and a practical man's first thought in this situation might have been about value, about what a 1909 IHC Famous engine in this condition might bring at an antique machinery auction, and it would be dishonest to say that thought didn't occur to him. It did. But it was not the thought that stayed. What stayed was the phrase, "It is the only thing of his I have." Let me tell you about what Keith Beaumont did next, because this is the part of the story that most people don't expect. He put the canvas back. He put the burlap back. He did not nail the lid down because the nails were spent, but he laid the boards back in place. He went back to his truck and sat in it for a while. Then he drove to Pawhuska. He had the address for Harlan Tesdall from the closing documents. He drove to the rental house on Maple Street and knocked on the door. Harlan answered it, and if he was surprised to see the man who had just bought his family's farm standing on his porch 14 miles away on the same day as the closing, he didn't show it. Harlan Tesdall was not a man who showed things easily. He was 68 years old, and he had signed his name to a piece of paper that ended 61 years, and he had driven home without stopping, and whatever he was feeling about any of it, he had put somewhere that didn't show on his face. Keith Beaumont told him what he'd found. He described the crate, described the engine, described the note. He said he thought Harlan should have it. He said he understood if Harlan didn't want to talk about it, but that he wasn't comfortable keeping something that had been written about that way. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside." Eunice made coffee. The three of them sat at the kitchen table in the rental house that smelled of other people's cooking, and Harlan told Keith Beaumont about the engine. He told him about Clement, about Arvid, about the farm in Comanche County that Arvid had homesteaded in 1902 and lost in 1928 when the notes came due and the wheat price dropped, and the sequence of events that the 1980s had just repeated for Harlan played out for the first time for his grandfather. He told Keith about how Clement had brought the engine with him when he came north, how it had sat in the barn for 56 years without being opened, how Harlan had known it was there but had felt that opening it was not something he had the right to do. He said he didn't know why he felt that way exactly. He said some things just feel like they belong to somebody else even when that somebody else is gone. Keith Beaumont listened to all of this without interrupting. When Harlan was finished, Keith said, "I'd like to give it back to you." Harlan said he didn't have anywhere to put it. Keith said he'd bring it to wherever Harlan wanted. Harlan looked at Eunice. Eunice looked at Harlan. Something passed between them that Keith Beaumont was not meant to understand. And then Harlan said, "All right, let me tell you about what happened over the next 6 months, because the story doesn't end with the crate being moved from one place to another." Keith Beaumont had the engine transported to the rental house in Pawhuska, where it sat in the garage under a tarp for the rest of 1987. In December of that year, Harlan's son, Gary Tesdall, who was 41 and worked as a machinist at a plant in Bartlesville, came home for Christmas. Gary was the kind of man who had grown up watching his father fix things and had taken that tendency and made it professional, which meant he understood machinery in a way that went deeper than most people's understanding. Not just how things worked, but why they worked, the logic of design, the intention of the engineer who had drawn the original plans. He went into the garage on the day after Christmas and pulled the tarp off. He stood there for a long time. Then he went back inside and told his father he wanted to restore it. Harlan said he didn't have the money for that. Gary said he did, or close enough. Harlan said it wasn't his to restore. Gary said it wasn't Clement's anymore either, and that maybe the point of a thing like this wasn't to leave it in a crate. They didn't argue about it. The Tesdall men were not arguers. But they had the conversation in the way that important conversations happen in families that don't argue, which is to say, they circled it quietly for 2 days and then arrived at an understanding without ever stating it directly. Gary took the engine to Bartlesville in January of 1988. Let me tell you about what restoring a 1909 IHC famous engine actually involves, because the work itself is part of the story, and you need to understand it. A hit-and-miss engine is named for its governing mechanism. It fires, hits, when the load demands it, and it coasts, misses, when the load doesn't. The flywheel stores the energy from each firing stroke and releases it gradually, which means the engine can run at a consistent speed even though it fires intermittently. In 1909, this was not a simple piece of engineering. The governor mechanism, which determines when to hit and when to miss, involves a set of weighted arms that respond to the flywheel's speed and the precision required to make those weights function correctly. Is the kind of precision that the International Harvester Company had to work out over years of iteration. The famous series was the result of that iteration. It was, by 1909, a mature design, reliable, efficient, repairable by the farmer who owned it using tools he already had. It was designed to be understood. That was the point of it. The engine Gary found in the crate had been preserved well enough that the internal components were in better condition than the external ones. The bore was clean. The piston rings were worn but not broken. The valves seated properly when Gary lapped them by hand, which took 3 evenings and a patience that most people don't have anymore. The igniter, a device that creates a spark by striking 2 contacts together inside the combustion chamber, a mechanism that preceded the spark plug and that most mechanics in 1988 had never worked on, needed new contact points, which Gary machined himself from stock he had at the plant. The fuel system needed new gaskets and a cleaned-out sediment bowl. The governor weights moved freely once he cleaned the pivot pins. The flywheel, which was cast iron and weighed 47 pounds, was true and uncracked. He had it turned on a lathe to clean up the surface and balanced it by feel in the way that machinists who have been doing something long enough can do by feel. He painted it red, the same red it had been when Arvid Tesdall bought it in 1909, using a color he matched from a fragment of original paint he found under the fuel tank bracket, where the weather hadn't reached it. He painted the cast lettering, famous IHC, the horsepower rating, in black over the red, the way the factory had done it. He made a new wooden base from white oak, not because the original base had been lost, but because he wanted it to have a base that was as good as the engine deserved. He finished the base with linseed oil. In April of 1988, he brought it back to Pawhuska. Harlan was in the garage when Gary pulled up. He helped carry it in, and they set it on the workbench, and Gary connected a small fuel line and primed the system and spun the flywheel. The engine fired on the 3rd revolution. It ran for a moment. Hit, miss, hit, miss. The governor doing exactly what it had been designed to do in 1909. And then it settled into its rhythm, that distinctive sound that anyone who has heard a hit-and-miss engine run knows immediately. A sound like a slow mechanical heartbeat, unhurried and certain. Harlan stood there and listened to it. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "My grandfather bought that new." Gary said he knew. Harlan said he paid $47.50 for it. Gary said he knew that too. Harlan said, "I wonder if he thought it would still be running." Gary said he probably hoped it would. Harlan said, "Yeah, I think that's right." That was the whole conversation. But it was enough. Now, let me tell you about Keith Beaumont again, because his part of this story wasn't finished either. Keith had leased the cropland on the Tesdall farm to a neighbor operation, as he'd planned, and he'd begun the process of thinking about what to do with the property long term. He had not gone back into the barn. In the fall of 1988, more than a year after the closing, he drove out to the farm to check on the fencing along the east boundary and found himself standing in front of the barn again. He went inside. He walked to the back corner where the crate had been and stood there looking at the empty space it had left, the rectangle of cleaner concrete where it had sat for 56 years. He stood there for a moment, and then he did something he hadn't planned to do. He started going through the rest of the stuff in that corner. What he found over the next 2 hours, pulling things out and setting them in the light from the barn door, was not a collection of junk. It was a collection of decisions. Every piece of equipment in that barn had been kept for a reason, and the reason was usually that Clement or Harlan had judged it worth keeping, which meant it worked or could be made to work or had some value that wasn't immediately apparent. There was a hay rake from the 1940s with a wooden seat and iron wheels that was complete and functional. There was a set of hand-forged cultivator shovels that Clement had made himself, the marks of the hammer still visible on the steel. There was a 2-man crosscut saw, 7 feet long, with a handle on each end and teeth that had been filed recently enough, relative to 1987, to still be sharp. There was a cream separator from the 1930s. All the parts present, the bowl and the discs and the hand crank, sitting in a wooden case that Clement had built for it. There was a collection of hand tools, draw knives, spoke shaves, chisels, planes, that had been wrapped in oilcloth and stored in a wooden box that was itself a piece of craftsmanship, the corners dovetailed, the lid fitted with a brass hasp that still worked smoothly. And in the very back, behind all of it, there was something Keith Beaumont had missed on his first pass through the barn. It was a forge. Not a portable forge, not a small farrier's setup, but a full blacksmith's forge. A cast-iron fire pot set into a brick hearth that Clement had built into the corner of the barn itself, the brickwork incorporated into the barn's foundation, which meant it had been part of the original construction in 1931. The blower was a hand-cranked Champion model, the kind that had been standard equipment in rural blacksmith shops since the 1890s, and it was still attached to the fire pot by a cast-iron pipe. The anvil, a 250-pound Fisher Eagle, the name still legible in the casting on the side, sat on an elm stump that had been set into the concrete floor, the stump itself hardened to the consistency of wood stone by 60 years of oil and heat. The tongs and hammers were hung on a rack that Clement had built from iron strap, and they were there, all of them, the way tools are when a man stops using them rather than when a man loses them. Keith Beaumont stood in front of that forge for a long time. He was a practical man. He thought about value. He thought about what a 250-pound Fisher Eagle anvil was worth, what a complete Champion blower was worth, what the hand-forged cultivator shovels were worth to someone who understood what they were. He thought about antique machinery dealers and auction houses and the market for this kind of thing in 1988, which was not nothing. He thought about all of that, and then he drove back to Pawhuska and knocked on the door on Maple Street again. Harlan answered it. He looked at Keith Beaumont standing on his porch for the second time in 14 months and said, "What did you find now?" Keith told him. He described the forge, the anvil, the tools, the cream separator, all of it. He said he thought Harlan should know what was there. He said he wasn't sure what the right thing to do was, but that it felt wrong to do anything without talking to Harlan first. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father built that forge the first winter. He said the ground was frozen and he couldn't work the fields, so he built the forge instead. He said Clement had been a blacksmith's apprentice in Texas before he came north, and he never stopped thinking like one. He said he made everything he could make himself. If he could make it, he didn't buy it. He said that was how they survived the Depression. He said, I should have told the bank about it." Keith said, "Probably." Harlan said, "I didn't think they'd understand what it was." Keith said, "They wouldn't have." Harlan said, "No, I don't suppose they would." They stood there for a moment. Then Harlan said, "What do you want to do with it?" Keith said he didn't know. He said he'd been thinking about it on the drive over and he still didn't know. He said, "What do you think it's worth?" Harlan said, "To who?" Keith said, "To anyone." Harlan said, "To the right person. Everything in that barn is worth more than the barn. To the wrong person, it's worth what the bank said it was worth." Keith said, $5,000. Harlan said, $5,000. Let me tell you about what happened to that barn over the next several years. because the story takes a turn that neither Harlan nor Keith anticipated. Keith Beaumont did not sell the contents of the barn. He did not call an auction house. What he did over the course of 1989 and 1990 was something that surprised people who knew him, which is to say, people who knew him as a dealership man, a practical man, a man whose relationship to old machinery was primarily commercial. He started learning how to use it. He found a man in Pawhuska named Emmett Holloway, who was 74 years old and had worked as a blacksmith for the Santa Fe Railroad until they closed the shop in 1962, and who had spent the subsequent 27 years being largely ignored by people who didn't need blacksmiths, which was most people. Keith asked Emmett if he'd be willing to come out to the farm and look at the forge. Emmett came out and looked at it and said it was a good forge, that whoever had built it knew what he was doing, that the fire pot was the right depth and the blower was positioned correctly, and the anvil was the best anvil he'd ever seen outside of a professional shop. He said Fisher Eagles were the best anvils made in America, and that a 250-pound one was rarer than most people knew. He said, "Where did all this come from?" Keith told him the story. Emmett said, "That man knew what he was doing." Keith said, "Yes, he did." Emmett came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. He showed Keith how to light the forge, how to manage the fire, how to read the color of the steel, the dull red that means the metal is warm but not workable, the bright orange that means it's ready, the yellow-white that means you've gone too far. He showed him how to use the tongs and the hammers, how to move the steel on the anvil, how to let the tool do the work rather than fighting it. Keith was not a natural blacksmith. His hands were dealer's hands, not smith's hands. But he was a learner, which is the more important quality, and by the end of 1989 he could make a hook, a hinge, a simple tool. By the end of 1990 he could do more than that. He called Harlan one evening in the fall of 1990. He said, "I've been learning to use your father's forge." Harlan said, "I know. Word gets around." Keith said, "I thought you should know I'm not using it for anything commercial." Harlan said, "I didn't think you were." Keith said, "I just wanted you to know." Harlan said, "Keith." Keith said, "Yes." Harlan said, "My father would have liked that you're using it. He would have thought it was the right thing." Keith said, "I hope so." Harlan said, "He didn't like things sitting idle. He thought idle things were a kind of waste. He thought if something could be used, it should be used." Keith said, "That's a good way to think about it." Harlan said, "It is. It's a very good way to think about it." Now, let me tell you about Gary Tesdall, because Gary's part of this story had not ended with the engine in April of 1988. Gary had gone back to Bartlesville after bringing the engine to Pawhuska, and he had continued working at the plant, and he had continued thinking about the engine. Not obsessively, not in a way that interfered with his life, but steadily, the way a machinist thinks about a problem, returning to it, examining it from different angles, setting it down and picking it up again. What he kept coming back to was the note. "Do not sell it. C.T. 1931. He thought about what it meant to write a note like that, to seal an engine in a crate with waxed canvas and preserving oil, and a handwritten instruction, to build the crate from the same wood as the barn, so that it would last as long as the barn lasted. He thought about what Clement Tesdall had understood about time that most people don't understand, which is that things outlast their owners, and that what you do with things while you have them determines what they become after you're gone. He started looking for other IHC engines, not to collect them, not exactly, but because the famous engine had shown him something about what it meant to build a thing well, and he wanted to understand that better. He found a 3-horsepower IHCM at a farm sale in Rogers County in 1989, incomplete but rebuildable. He found a 6-horsepower Associated Chore Boy at an estate sale in Washington County in 1990, in worse condition but with all the major castings intact. He found, at a junk dealer's yard in Claremore, a 1-cylinder Fairbanks Morse Z that had been used to power an irrigation pump and had been sitting outside since approximately 1955, which meant it had been sitting outside for 35 years and was in the condition you would expect. He bought all of them. He brought them to a shop he rented in Bartlesville, and he restored them, one at a time, with the same patience and precision he'd brought to the famous. He documented everything: the condition when found, the work performed, the parts made or sourced, the hours spent. He kept the documentation in a 3-ring binder that sat on the shelf above his workbench. By 1993, he had 7 engines. By 1996, he had 14. He started taking them to shows: the Tri-State Gas Engine and Tractor Show in Portland, Indiana, the Midwest Old Threshers Reunion in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, the Antique Power Show in Hutchinson, Kansas. He set them up on a trailer and ran them, all of them at once when the show permitted it, and people gathered around to watch the flywheels spin and listen to the hit-and-miss rhythm and ask questions. And Gary answered every question with the patience of a man who had learned something worth sharing. He was not a performer. He was not selling anything. He was just running the engines and answering questions, which turned out to be exactly what people wanted. He always brought the famous. He always told the story. Not the whole story, not at first, but the essential parts: the crate under the hayloft, the note, the $47.50, Arvid Tesdall buying it new in the spring of 1909. He told it the way his father would have told it, which is to say plainly and without embellishment, and the plainness of it was what made people stop and listen. He told it to farmers who remembered engines like it from their childhoods. He told it to young people who had never seen a hit-and-miss engine run, and who stood watching the flywheel with an expression that Gary had come to recognize, an expression that meant they were hearing something they hadn't expected to hear, which was the sound of a machine that was patient. That was the word people used eventually: patient. The engine sounded patient. It fired when it needed to, and rested when it didn't, and it had been doing this since 1909 and showed no indication of stopping. Let me tell you about what happened in the summer of 1997, because this is the part of the story that closes the circle in a way that nobody planned. Gary Tesdall was at the Antique Power Show in Hutchinson, Kansas, in July of 1997, running his engines on a trailer in the east field, when a man came and stood at the edge of his display for a long time without saying anything. Gary noticed him because most people either came close and asked questions or kept moving, and this man did neither. He was about 60 years old, well dressed for a farm show, which is to say he was wearing clothes that were clean and fitted in a way that suggested he didn't usually spend time in fields. He stood there for a long time, looking at the engines, and then he walked up and pointed at the famous and said, "Where did you get that one?" Gary told him. He told the whole story. The man listened without interrupting, the way Keith Beaumont had listened at the kitchen table in Pawhuska 10 years earlier. When Gary was finished, the man said, "My grandfather sold that engine." Gary said, "I'm sorry." The man said, in 1928, when he sold the farm. He said his grandfather's name was Arvid Tesdall. He said his grandfather had come north from Comanche County and started over, and that the family had lost track of where the engine ended up. He said he'd been looking for it, not seriously, not with any real expectation of finding it, but looking the way you look for something when you know the odds are against you, but can't stop looking anyway. His name was Dale Tesdall. He was Harlan's nephew, the son of Harlan's older brother, Dale Sr., who had left Oklahoma in 1952 and gone to Kansas, and whose branch of the family had stayed in Kansas ever since. He had driven to the Hutchinson show because someone at his local farm bureau had mentioned there was a man there with a collection of IHC engines, and something in him had said, "Go look." Gary called Harlan that evening from the motel. He told him who he'd met. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Dale's boy." Gary said, "Yes." Harlan said, "I haven't talked to him in 20 years. Gary said, "I know." Harlan said, "How does he look?" Gary said, "He looks good. He looks like you a little." Harlan said, "Lord." He paused. He said, "Bring him to Pawhuska." Gary said, "He wants to come." Harlan said, "I know he does. Bring him. Let me tell you about the visit because it matters." Dale Tesdall Jr. drove to Pawhuska in August of 1997. He and Harlan sat on the porch of the rental house on Maple Street. Eunice had passed in 1993, and Harlan had stayed in the rental house because he didn't see the point of moving again, and they talked for most of an afternoon. Gary was there. Keith Beaumont came because Gary had called him and told him what was happening, and Keith drove down from Tulsa and sat on the porch steps and mostly listened. They talked about Clement and Arvid and the farm in Comanche County, and the farm in Osage County, and what had happened to both of them and why, and they talked about the engine, and at some point Harlan went inside and came back with the note. He handed it to Dale Jr. Dale Jr. read it. He read it twice. Then he handed it back and said he kept it because it was the only thing of his father's he had. Harlan said, "Yes." Dale Jr. said, "And now you kept it because it's the only thing of his you have." Harlan said, "I suppose that's right." Dale Jr. said, "And Gary kept it running." Harlan looked at Gary. Gary looked at the porch floor. Harlan said, "Gary kept it running." Keith Beaumont said nothing. He was sitting on the porch steps looking out at the street, and he was thinking about the day he'd pried open the crate in the barn, and about the note, and about what it meant that a man could write a note in 1931 and have it arrive via a sequence of events that nobody could have predicted or planned, at a porch in Pawhuska in 1997, where the people who needed to read it were sitting. He didn't say any of this. He was a practical man, but he thought it. Let me tell you about where the engine is now, because the story has one more stop. In the fall of 1997, Gary Tesdall and Dale Tesdall Jr. came to an agreement that took about 15 minutes to reach and required no lawyers. The engine would go to Dale Jr.'s farm in Reno County, Kansas, which was the county adjacent to the one where Arvid Tesdall had homesteaded in 1902 before coming south to Comanche County. It would be displayed in Dale Jr.'s barn, running on the wooden base Gary had made from white oak, with the operating manuals and the parts diagram and the note. The original note, in Clement's handwriting, framed now behind glass, mounted on the wall above it. Gary would come once a year to service it. Dale Jr. would learn to run it himself. The engine would not go to a museum. It would not go to a show permanently. It would stay on a farm, which is where it had always been. Harlan said, "That's right. that's where it belongs. He died in March of 2001 at 82 in the rental house on Maple Street in Pawhuska. Gary drove down and sat with him at the end, and on the last evening Harlan was coherent enough to talk. He asked Gary if the engine was still running. Gary said it was. Harlan said, "Good." He said, "Your great-great-grandfather paid $47.50 for it." Gary said, "I know." Harlan said, "In 1909. Gary said, "Yes." Harlan said, "That's a long time for $47.50 to go." Gary said, "It is." Harlan said, "Clement would have thought so too." Then he said, "Don't let it sit idle." Gary said he wouldn't. Harlan said, "Idle things are a waste." Gary said, I know that." Harlan